Well, thank you, Paul, for helping me in my project.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name's Paul Torrance. I worked at NASA for 27 years. Started out in life support and crew and thermal systems division. Then I worked in quality. Quality had a big push in the 1980s. I became a quality engineer and worked in safety, worked in pressure systems, and did work on the space shuttle, quality engineer for the space shuttle, going out, working problems to try to make sure the space shuttle is safe. And recently I've written a book. You may have seen The Dark Side of NASA. So I did publish a book. It's Missed Opportunities for Leadership and Imagination in a Bureaucracy. So basically I write that NASA was an immature organization and initially directed by a president as what to do. So once Neil Armstrong came back, they naturally just waited to be told what to do instead of standing on their own 2 feet and leading. So there's always been a lack of leadership and a lack of vision because NASA waited to be told what to do. And so with an immature organization, you don't learn lessons, you don't apply lessons. And as the world got safer, had cars that had front impact testing, side impact testing, rollover test, as they added the shoulder belt, airbags everywhere, crash dummy testing, as the world stepped into the crash dummy testing space age, NASA stepped out. Mercury had a launch escape system, Gemini, Apollo, all crash dummy tested with crash dummies in it, ahead of the automakers. But then all of a sudden you have this space shuttle with no launch escape system. In a day and age when safety, health, and wellness are becoming more and more important, and automakers and businesses, you have OSHA VPP. As the world was getting safer, NASA took more risk. And I think that was due to a lack of leadership. So that's what my book is about.
I'm definitely going to make a point of getting your book today and plan to read it in the next month. I wish I had read it before this interview.
That's fine. And feel free to ask questions about it. I mean, because I do have, in the truth triangle, so here's the triangle. We'd like to think we're all knowing, but we're all basically apprentices trying to learn. And, I've worked at NASA, so I may think I have some truths, but other people will say Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. But we all want to learn, and this is the knowledge era when everyone has knowledge of everything. And so we're all just trying to learn, and anything I can do, any questions you have, I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Well, actually, I have quite a few, kind of different than what I had planned, but you mentioned about lack of leadership at NASA. And I was just trying to think about the constant struggles that we have with a direction for our space program. And just looking at it as an outsider, it seems like if you choose a direction, that is sort of selecting one part of the organization over the other. And you immediately create your counterforce to whatever leadership you have. And it becomes basically sort of like a tug of war contest.
Right.
And if you try to create a vision that includes everybody, you really haven't created any leadership because now you're just still a mob going in 1,000 different directions. And
yes.
Just from an outsider standpoint, that seems to be the dynamic that I see. And I was wondering, does that relate at all to your insider perspective?
So I talk about this a little bit in my book, and I use what I call the success equation. Leadership times vision equals success. And this is in my book. But when you have a good plan for the future and you have a leader that takes that good plan, I think you're going to be successful. So initially with NASA, Wernher von Braun laid out a long-term plan to go to the moon. And since it was a Cold War, whatever it was, the Republicans and Democrats, one of the few times they hold hands and sing God Bless America together is when 911 happens or there's a war. Otherwise, they don't hold hands, it seems, you know. But when everyone's together and you have a good long-term plan, you can be successful. So like in the Bible, Joseph had he saw 7 fat years. Actually, the Pharaoh saw the 7 fat years and 7 skinny years. That's a 14-year plan. So to go to the moon was about a 9-year plan. And Joseph said, well, look, what you're seeing is we're going to have 7 plentiful years, then we're going to have famine. You need to save and prepare for the future. So it's all about preparing for the future, getting everyone preparing for the future. And it was a long-term plan. So NASA initially had that plan. They had the leadership, they had the Wernher von Braun long-term plan, and they put safety first. They had the launch escape systems on Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. And after that, I think they became irrational and just said, oh, we can make the shuttle, it's not going to fail. And really thought they could make a rocket that wouldn't blow up. But rockets still fail once or twice out of every 100 launches. Some improved with time. The solid rocket booster improved on the space shuttle. They did a lot of testing afterwards that it would have been after the Challenger loss. They did a lot of testing. It would have been nice if that testing had been done up front. So you didn't have that upfront testing with the space shuttle. You had this culture that is rushing to get to the moon. And once they got to the moon, there was no leader to say, let's catch our breath and slow down and end this rush culture. So without leadership, your culture doesn't change. Your organization doesn't change, and they just kept thinking, we got to push. The Russians are on our heels. And that was one of the problems. You end up with a space shuttle that doesn't have the quality up front. I'll also say, I think the foundation for success for NASA and almost any organization is safety, health, wellness, and cost effectiveness. And touching just a little more on what you said, there is a success story with NASA. That the Space Shuttle program and the Space Station program, these are very large programs, and they provide a lot of jobs long term. So there has been success, but once these programs get going, they have a lot of inertia and they're hard to change. So after Challenger, there's people saying, look, we need to get out of the space shuttle business, but this program has this inertia and it is just hard to move, hard to change. So these government programs need to be effectively thought through and developed up front. And another lesson learned you could have from the space shuttle or space station or the Mars Observer is to have smaller programs. But these smaller programs that don't have as much inertia can get axed and canceled more easily. So this is a battle the government has with these government programs. Does that answer some of your question or give you some more thoughts or insight?
Definitely, but I mean, just coming to our current Artemis plan and trying to get to the moon in 2024, you know, I mean, Jim Bridenstine during an all NASA town meeting about a year ago was asked the question anonymously by one of the NASA workforce: is this maybe it went anonymous, maybe it was actually on the speaker, but is this 2024 date schedule over safety? And his response was, it wasn't schedule over safety, it's a return to schedule. That we actually need to kind of do the things that we communicate that we're going to do. But from your perspective, do you think we're rushing back to the moon with the 2024 date?
So since I don't work at NASA anymore, I can't, I wouldn't be, what's the word? I don't have the expertise to say what they're doing or not doing now. I'm no longer a part of it. I'm an outsider looking in. But I will say, I don't think exploration is a foundation for success. I don't think schedule is a foundation for success. I think it's safety, health, wellness, and cost effectiveness. I think the more we do up front, to just, and one of the recommendations following the Challenger accident was to separate crew and cargo to get to low Earth orbit.
Mm-hmm.
That still hasn't been done. I still think the foundation for success is to have a passenger car, so to speak, to get people just up and down to orbit, and to work on your survival, escape, and rescue systems, your launch escape systems, work on your safety, and test all that, and continue to develop new models like you do automobiles on Earth. I think the foundation for success is just getting to low Earth orbit cost effectively, and working on safety, health, and wellness, and being cost effective. Your cargo can all be launched separately, but of course that doesn't seem to be what's happening. You still have they're gonna have a big rocket now, and you still have 2 solid rocket boosters, basically to have jobs in Utah. That's why the rocket is being built that way. You had the old jobs program, and it's trying to fit into the old scheme of things. And then President Obama took the opportunity during all the mayhem and change to take about $2 billion and give that back to the Democratic state of California. Again, in my opinion, it's called commercialization, but it looks like sole sourcing to me. It just looks like money from a Republican state going to a Democratic state. So this is probably an oversimplification, but it looks to me like now we're going to have a Republican rocket and a Democratic rocket to go to space. The Elon Musk Democratic state rocket and the Republican, mostly Republican state rockets are old guard. That's a vast oversimplification. But with that simplification, I think we can say politics plays a big role in how NASA does business. It's a political organization, and engineers have to deal with the politics. So here's another way to look at it. Initially, Wernher von Braun laid out an engineering plan to go to the moon, and the politicians carved out the pie and had the centers. And once Apollo was over, what's next for NASA? Well, whatever you do, the pie is already carved. You try to fit your engineering into the pie instead of doing the engineering and have the pie adjust to your engineering. So NASA engineers still have to deal with that today.
Now, you mentioned safety, you mentioned von Braun, which trigger in my mind, we have a North Houston Space Society chapter. We have monthly meetings here in North Houston, and we invite guest speakers. Our guest speaker last month, that was held virtually, with the COVID-19, was Lee Hutchinson from Ars Technica. And he did a big research. He is a big, what should you say, historian, or he's really interested in like the Apollo program. He volunteers on Saturday to give tours of the Saturn V rocket that they have. And he's done a lot of research and what have you into it. But he says like the first stage of the Saturn V had just crazy safety margins. Like the amount of engineering and safety built into that first stage of the Saturn V rocket is just unbelievable. And he pointed out the time that the Saturn V got struck by lightning, I think twice during one of the launches, and it kind of reset the entire electrical system. But that first stage was still able to complete its task because of kind of all those independent safety systems. And I was wondering if you had any sort of additional color or detail around the safety of the Saturn V.
So I write about that in my book, and I call this the Apollo 13 unlearned lesson that led to this view that Apollo was all this, Apollo was all great. And when they had the Challenger hearings, the people doing this Challenger inquisition, actually you have 2 investigations during Challenger. You have the Rogers Commission, and then you have the senators second-guessing Rogers Commission. And the people advising the Rogers Commission were the Apollo era heroes. And they're trying to distance themselves from this Challenger accident. And they say that things have changed. It's gone downhill. Apollo had all this redundancy, and the way we did business was also good. And it's all baloney. It's all baloney. Apollo was a rocket. They only had 18, 19 launches. The space shuttle was intended to be used hundreds of times. And like I said, Apollo had the launch escape system. You didn't have a rocket mounted to the same, you didn't have a space shuttle mounted to the side of a rocket. That's a pretty crazy design, the space shuttle design. Your crew's on top. So it was inherently safer by design, tested more, but they made a lot of mistakes. On Apollo 13, they had all the same blunders before launch with their contractors, people not talking. And when Apollo 13 was going to the moon, if the lunar module and command module had separated, when they stirred that oxygen tank and it blew up, they all would have died. And you wouldn't have this arrogance and these people saying, oh, the Apollo rocket was all this and all that. They would have been much humbler, and I don't think they would have built the space shuttle the way it was built. You would have had a much humbler organization. And even recently, I talked about how in lessons learned, after Apollo 13, they said, well, we used the lunar module as a lifeboat, but it was never used as a lifeboat. So when the Titanic sunk, people got into lifeboats and they waited to be rescued. But on Apollo 13, when that command module blew up, they got into the lunar module, which was connected. They turned it on. They used its propulsion system. So it was another spacecraft. They had system level redundancy, and that saved their lives. And that system level redundancy should have been in the launch escape system on the space shuttle. They didn't learn their lesson. They also didn't realize. They went back to the Senate, and the Senate said, this is such a great success story, Apollo 13. This is an amazing success. There should have been that light bulb that went off in some leader's head. I call it the leadership light bulb that said, you know what? If we blow up the space shuttle and we keep the crew alive, everyone's going to applaud us again. Let's make sure we put, and as I'm going to say again, safety, health, and wellness above everything else, because it's what matters most. But NASA put astronauts on the back seat and said, well, they know the risks they're taking. We can take more risk. So as the world was becoming less adverse to risk, the managers of NASA were taking more risk in a day and age when the customer didn't want that risk anymore. We got to the moon. You should be able to read the customer. See, part of leadership is understanding your customer. Well, after Apollo 13, you beat the Russians to the moon. What's the customer want now? They're saying this is such a great success story. You didn't get any moon rocks, but the astronauts are alive. That's when that light bulb should come on, and we say, look, let's focus. We're going to launch the space shuttle 400 times. We're going to blow up a few of them. Let's try to keep the crew alive, because everyone will say, look at NASA. In my book, I say, if the Challenger crew had lived, they would have gone to the White House, the Apollo 13 crew come. They would have taken photos. Oh, it's chip off the old block. The new kids, they still got the right stuff. Oh, it's NASA, it's Apollo on steroids. Look, we're so proud of them. But since they died, those Apollo people distanced themselves. Oh, no, things have changed. Woo, it's gone downhill. Oh, this is bad. We're not responsible for this. But the truth is, those Apollo old-timers were the most responsible for that space shuttle tragedy, because they could have led and they could have designed the future spacecraft and learned lessons from Apollo 13 to focus on crew safety, health, and wellness, the foundation for success. So how's that?
That's great.
Does that make sense?
It does. I just, it kind of calls in some questions about what is the role of our space program? I mean, like, why have a space program? What's your thoughts?
I think it's real simple. Not exploration. We want to go to the moon just because we can, and we're human. We don't need an excuse. I mean, it's there. We can do it. We're going to do it. Go to Mars. We're going to do it. We're curious. We want to see what's there. We're just humans And we're capable, we're curious, and we don't need excuses. We want to do it.
So you said not exploration. I'm just wondering, like, let's just say hypothetically, you looked at humanity 500 years from now.
Yes.
Would you be okay with a civilization that is all exclusively on Earth, taking little day trips to places in the solar system? Or would you have the expectation that humanity has grown beyond the Earth? Like, which one of those kind of fit more into your conception of the future?
So, in geological terms, 500 years isn't much time, you know. So 500 years from now, do you have any kids?
I do. I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old.
So you have two, and then if those two have kids, each one has two, it becomes four. And if those four have kids, it becomes eight. If those eight have kids, it becomes 16, 32. So 500 years from now is about 25 generations.
Yeah, 500 years from now, everybody's related to me.
Right. You have your two kids become 4, 8, 16. So 2 to the power of 25 becomes like 10 million. So you and I, we're going to be dead, but as great dead grandfathers, we probably have 2 or 3 weddings together to go to.
Oh, exactly.
Along with hundreds of thousands of other people. So, but here's what I think about 500 years from now. So there's going to be one major change between now and 500 years from now for humanity, and that is the population is going to become stabilized. Sometime between 30 years, it may take a while, but between 30 years and maybe 150 years from now, probably 30 or 40, the world's population is going to peak and it's going to stabilize. And I'm going to make a prediction. Once that population stabilizes, we're going to have a second renaissance of humanity. So following the next time the population levels off, stabilizes, we will have another renaissance, similar to the first renaissance that followed the Black Death, or during the Black Death. So I say there's a relation between the Black Death and the Renaissance, and the population was stable after 1348, 1350 AD for a couple hundred years due to disease. The population stabilized and you had a renaissance. Well, in 30 or 40 years, it won't be disease. Coronavirus is like a flea on us. We're just going to flick it off. As far as population goes, the world's population is going to go up of about 100 million people this year. Coronavirus may kill 500,000, but it's going to, coronavirus will knock it down 500,000, but it's going to go up 100 million people this year, and it continues to go up. But at some point, we'll stabilize the population. So 500 years from now, I think we're going to be in the middle of the third renaissance of humanity. And I think that'll be followed by a fourth renaissance. So I foresee a second, third, and fourth renaissance. 500 years from now, we'll be in that third renaissance. And 500 years from now, I still don't foresee a lot of people on the moon or on Mars or on Antarctica. It's just not a great place to live, but we can do research, we can do science, and I just think there will just still be a handful of people on Mars, maybe 10 to 50, maybe more on the moon, but I just don't foresee a lot of people. That cost is just so expensive to live these other places, and to build a civilization, it just takes such an amazing foundation. So I don't foresee however many people there are in Antarctica in 500 years. I think you can double that number or half that number. That's what you'll have on the moon, and half it again. That's what you'll have on Mars. So if there's 500 people in Antarctica, 500 years from now, you'll have maybe 200 or 100 on the moon, and maybe 10 or 20 on Mars. I just don't think it's not a solution to population, and that that solution is going to take care of itself in the second renaissance. The population will stabilize, and the only reason we'll want to go to those places again is for curiosity. And then as now, safety, health, wellness, and cost effectiveness will be your foundation for success. Your body falls apart. You go into space, you lose 1% of your bone mass per day, and your hips and your heels. Your body falls apart. You've got that weightlessness. When I worked at NASA, I saw people that went on that Vomit Comet, and they came back dizzy and sick for a week, 2 weeks. And space is not it's not like, oh, this is so much fun now and see the Earth. It's tough, and your body's falling apart. You got radiation. And then we also have a responsibility when these astronauts go to the moon or go to Mars, if and when they come back, we want to make sure that they have wellness in their 60s, 65, 70, 75, that they don't have Parkinson's disease more than other human beings. So I still foresee the biggest challenge is just wellness, trying to have keep these people healthy and well that go to these other places. That in itself, I think, is a huge, huge challenge. I believe that's the challenge that we face.
Yeah, in terms of overpopulation, I couldn't agree with you more. It's going to be far easier to create more cities like Tokyo to replace cities like Mumbai and Mexico City than it is to try to put massive numbers of people off of the earth to someplace else.
So, I'm in Houston, so I was driving downtown Houston. I thought, I haven't seen it so clear from 20 miles away since the 1970s. Rush hour traffic almost seems pleasant. But we don't have to lower the population, but if we just stabilize the world's population, and it's going to happen, not in my lifetime, I don't think, but this renaissance is coming, and things will get better, but there will be major, major problems. One problem is if things do seem to get better, bad organizations and bad governments may almost seem tolerable. Well, North Korea, things are pretty good here, but still, you got totalitarianism. So I think there will be an increase of individuality and individualism in the next 100 years, and people will dissent and not believe anything they hear. Like they'll listen to our podcast. Who's this Paul Torrance? I'm going to second guess everything he said, and they should. I think that dissent will be very important in the future as we gain more and more knowledge. So,
well, we gain, as a population, I feel like we're gaining more and more factoids that we place credence on based upon how many other people seem to be echoing those factoids, as opposed to having a framework of actual reasoning and logic and some type of methodical way of sorting through that information.
It's always hard to filter out bias. So CNN, obviously, they're influenced by the Democratic Party and Democratic thinking. Fox News, Republicans. So when you listen to them, they're biased. The Challenger accident. Well, the Apollo old-timers coming in, they're biased. Another thing I talk about in my book is the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. Well, the people on the judge and jury, they don't want to point the fingers at themselves. Someone else is responsible. So you always have this bias. And we have to deal with bias and dissent and being open-minded, thinking on your own, second-guessing everything is what's going to be needed in the future to avoid bad management, bad people that call themselves leaders, but they're not leaders. They're just in charge. So does that make sense?
It does. But, a big difference between 1986, when we had the Challenger disaster, and today is that we all had very much like the same stream of news and information. As an example, when did you learn that we were going to the moon in 2024?
Well, Just reading about it on various websites, but I don't put a lot of credence in it because I've been hearing when I worked at NASA, well, George W. Bush, not George W. Bush, the elder George Bush, Dan Quayle was over his space council, whatever. We're gonna go to Mars by this date. We're gonna go to the moon. We had all these so-called strategic plans when I worked at NASA, but none of them were ever strategic. The one thing we did was we helped fund the Russians under Bill Clinton, and then Obama gave us the most direction we've ever been given. He gave us a directive to no longer discriminate against gays, transgenders, and such. This is the most vision and most direction we ever had when I was at NASA. Otherwise, it was just space shuttle to space station and space station back to space shuttle. You had these two big jobs programs. So, and now you've got Elon Musk on the scene. And it's almost like you have two different hearings when they go before Congress now. You've got the NASA hearing, and then you've got the Elon Musk just go do whatever you want hearings. And I'm not sure there's an organized vision for the future. I don't know, but I'm not a part of it. So I guess my dissent, and I'm just very leery of believing anything they say until you see the plan laid out. What I say is, in fact, I recently wrote a letter to a politician on this, and I gave them some advice. Because one thing I did once, when I worked at NASA, I got reassigned. I started writing letters to politicians. So I have put some thought on this, but I don't want to go into it. But I wrote a letter to a politician recently. But basically, I said, "Where's the plan? What's the plan? There ought to be." Remember, Apollo had that long-term plan. Von Braun told him how to do it. Okay, where's the plan now? What's the plan? What's the strategy? And I have not heard the NASA administrator use the words I say for the foundation for that plan to be successful. Again, safety, health, and wellness. I still believe that's the foundation. If you take care of your people, you develop safe transportation as safe as possible, launch escape systems, redundant systems Apollo 13 had. You focus on safety, health, and wellness, everything else will fall in place. You get all of that quality up front, and that's what's needed up front. And I'm not hearing that rhetoric, but then again, I'm not digging for it. I'm not a part of NASA anymore, and I hope NASA does well. I wish NASA well. It's a great organization. I love working there. All the stuff about the culture being bad, I thought that was all bogus. We had good culture. We had fun. It was just a matter of communication and dissent and how things were set up on high critical discussion items, how people communicate when things are highly critical. And that can happen in any organization. That's risk management. So,
Well, the Mike Pence last year, I think it was March, he announced that 2024 would be the date that we should target to land people, the first woman and the next man on the moon. NASA, all their Facebook and Twitter and, their website, kind of reemphasizes that date. Since December, the middle of December till now, I've done a little over 150 interviews. Of
wow.
those, and these interviews have been with people on, at coffee shops, in the mall, on the streets, in the airports. I did all the interviews in person up until the lockdown, which was like at the first part of March.
Fantastic.
And of those 150 interviews, would you like to take a guess of how many of them had heard about us going to the moon in 2024?
Well, based on another study I saw where they take people in and ask them about different government programs, usually people off the street or people coming in, it was usually 5% to 10% know of any typical government program or what that government entity does. So what is that about right?
I would say about 20 out of that 150. So that's a little bit, that's right around that number, I would say.
Yeah. And of course, this study I saw was back before everyone had cell phones and instant information. So yeah, it's amazing. It's a more people need to vote. More people need to be involved in government and understand what all their programs are doing. And like our spending is just out of control.
I
Government
know.
spending, they act like it's never going to have an effect, but it is going to have an effect. I think we'll have some inflation eventually.
I mean, we just spent $1 trillion in a week without blinking an eye. It's just like that. It was like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, I lived in Brazil for 1 year when I was 8 years old, and they were having amazing inflation. We would bring in Cruzeiros, and a $100,000 Cruzeiro, you trade it in and get like a $1 Cruzeiro. The old money had inflated 100,000 times to one in 1 year, 2 years, whatever it was. I was just a kid.
I went to Brazil for a couple of weeks back in '91. And, whatever I left, I think it was like 300 to 1. And by the time I came back, it was 350 to 1. And you had like currency where instead of printing new currency, they just put a stamp on the old one. Is this the same time period you were there?
This was 1968, 69. So I'm probably a little older than you. So probably, but it probably happened again. This is what it sounds like. So I'm surprised we haven't had some inflation yet here in the United States. If they just start printing money, which is sometimes called adding to the money supply, but if you just add and add and add, you're just printing money out the gazoo.
Yeah.
So,
well, you definitely see the inflation in like, maybe property values and house values in certain areas. And, I guess,
well,
yeah.
Once you go to buy a gallon of milk and it costs $100,
yes,
or you go to buy gas, so commodities, nationwide commodities, once you go to buy a gallon of gasoline and it's $200, and even that's cheap because gasoline is cheap right now. So then you'll know inflation is really hit, and you have to, your salary, let's say if someone makes 50,000 a year, well, they have to make 500,000 a year to be at the same standard today. So everything just spirals out of control. So.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. I mean, you talk about the way to increase the minimum wages is inflation. If it costs $100 for a thing of milk, then spending $15 an hour for a person's labor is really cheap, but is also not worth anything.
So China is trying to stabilize. China will stabilize its population. In fact, I use the word stabilize since we're a free nation, claim to be a free nation. So, but China will control their population, and in a few years, they're probably going to stabilize, control their population. So we may see some of this renaissance and control begin in China, but it has to be a worldwide effect. The United States, our population is still not stabilized. Politicians never talk about it. All we hear is coronavirus. There's nothing about, look, we need to stabilize the population. It's the greatest problem we have, and we never talked about it. When Princess Diana died, there was all this outpouring and all this time spent on her. And I remember a man saying one time there was not one single public announcement on the need to wear seatbelts.
Wow.
When you drive a car. All this outpouring, all this television time, not one public announcement on the need for buckling up when you're in a vehicle. Coronavirus. Politicians never talk about stabilizing the world's population. It's the greatest short-term challenge we face, and it's never discussed. And then stabilizing the budget. We never talk about how to stabilize the budget. They pretend. So I write about that some in my book too.
Yeah, especially now. Now the budget is, it's just like, the printing money, like you said. So talking about budgets, do you think NASA's budget is about right, or should it be lower, higher? What are your thoughts? Like,
Now I did hear the administrator talk about the budget, and it seems like the budget's about right. 0.5% of the federal budget, 0.5% or whatever, something along those lines.
It used to
And
be. Now it's like 0.10 after we started building trillions and trillions of dollars in weeks and
yeah,
weeks.
but again, I think you just have this long-term plan. If you have the vision, let's go to Mars 2050, and we can have the options of the moon to practice launching, landing, and building habitats, and really seeing how dirt cheap you can live. So a lesson learned again from the space shuttle and space station is to not, and Mars Observer, is try not to have these huge government programs that cost a lot of money. Try to have a new approach. What's the minimum we can keep people alive, barely alive, and I just say that for effect. What's the cheapest you can run a small base on the moon, and to see if you can keep cutting that cost down instead of making it into a program. We're going to have this Artemis lunar program. Now you got this program, and that program has a level of funding, and it gobbles up all that money and wants more. And you're stuck with that program being the way it is. So you become programized instead of having a goal. So I think that you have the long-term goal of let's send humans to Mars, return them safely and in good health and in good wellness, so that when they get back, they don't have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So focus on the human element and just see if you can be cost effective. And if you have this long-term plan, then the senators, you don't have all the infighting. So when I hired into NASA in 1985 to work life support, after 2 or 3 months, the politicians took my job and gave it to Alabama. So I was doing different work. So you have these politicians that keep carving the pie, and these programs that keep changing, or they get going and they just get killed. So you need this long-term vision and plan. That's what NASA needs. And return to the moon in 4 years, that's not that long-term goal. I think the long-term goal is a large step for a lady on red soil, and a humbler step for the humans this time. Be a little more humble, So that's what I see. That long-term plan with the lady stepping out. I also think they could commercialize. They could use advertising a lot. I mean, what will the first toothbrush that's used on Mars be? And the first toothpaste, will it be AIM or Colgate? That's got to be a $10 million question, I mean, you could just about which can of beans? Will it be Campbell's or, almost everything you do? The first bottle of wine, heck, the first will be the Marlboro Man. Let someone smoke a cigarette. That's getting real political. But so that may not be a good example. But just about everything can be thought out, and you can pay for a lot of the mission. Even going back to the moon. Which toothbrush will it be? I mean, it seems like we could let advertising pay for a lot of these missions, and I don't know if NASA's thought of that or not. So, or Elon Musk on his own, or whoever. But there's a lot of money in advertising. Super Bowl, how much is a Super Bowl commercial? Going back to the moon, it's got to be worth 10 times a Super Bowl commercial. Right?
Well, it all depends on how many people watch. The first time
watch, it's been so long, people don't believe it happened. They're going to have to watch again to just see it. Like when the Wright brothers flew, they just started disbelieving in France. So the Wright brothers had to go over to France to fly their little plane just for people. Oh, I guess they really did do it. They were getting left behind. They were getting left in the dust by the French. So,
yeah,
when were you born?
75. The same year as Bridenstine.
Yeah, but so the lunar program was over by then. It was all a hoax, right? No one's ever been. You don't believe it. You'd like to see it, right? Don't you want to see
I would like to see it. I would like to see it too. But triangulating radio waves is not that complex of a task, and I'm sure the Russians have loved nothing but to expose an Apollo fake landing.
You know what? And another part of Apollo 13, the Russians wrote a letter to the president saying, look, we can help. The whole world came together. This entire focus on safety, health, and wellness, first and foremost, should have been the lesson learned from Apollo 13. And NASA should be the leader in survival, escape, and rescue, and seatbelts, airbags, the keeping people alive, because the world's gotten better. The world's gotten safer. Our wellness is a word I embrace now. It's not a word that's been around. And I left it out of my book. I wish I'd put it in there, because I offer a philosophy at the end. I say put safety and health first. But every time I give a book to someone, I write that word wellness in there too. It's just such a great encompassing word. And it's what NASA needs to focus on to be successful in the future, or any organization. It's a universal concept. It's what we've come to, quality of life.
Yeah, definitely. I mentally, emotionally, physically, the whole gambit of wellness.
Yeah. Yep.
So if it was affordable and safe, would you personally have an interest in going into space?
I don't think so. I don't think so. There's just other places I'd rather go. And I think the more we go into space and go to the moon or to Mars, the more we're going to realize just how great planet Earth is. I don't want to go to Antarctica, really. If I'm going to be cold, I want to go to a ski resort, go to Colorado, Utah, the beaches. I'd like to go to Rome. I've got some airline points saved up and some hotel points. I'd really like to go to Rome. I'd like to go to Chile, to Europe, Florida. There's a lot of places I want to go on Mars and the moon. Any place outside Earth is not on my bucket list. I just think there are going to be places where we try to keep people alive and see what we can learn. The exploration is going to be exploring how to keep people safe, health, and well. That's going to be the exploration. I believe that's what we're going to explore, is ourselves, and we're going to use that to live better here. You could grow plants on Mars, and I don't want to go into this too much, just exposed to the atmosphere, because there is carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. It's just about a vacuum. But you've got the sunlight. It's not nearly as much as Earth. It's extremely cold, but like strawberries or plants that don't grow very high, you could just heat the ground, maybe cover it as a greenhouse, and you don't have to have a pressurized system. You can just roll out. You don't want to take a lot of materials. It's going to cost so much to do anything on Mars, especially initially. The cost will just be so high. But you could grow plants just exposed to the atmosphere. You have to give them water. If you can just keep them warm enough, you don't have a lot of convection because there's not much atmosphere, just if you can stop the radiation. So I think the initial exploration will be, how can you grow plants and grow a lot? But a million people on Mars or a million people on the moon, I just can't see that if you want them to have safe lives, healthy lives, and to have wellness. It's just not going to happen. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a pessimist, I don't think. I'm just a realist, and I just there's no need to have a million people on Mars. If we stabilize our population here, and we can live better. You'll never live better than you live on Earth. You'll never live better, with the exception of maybe if you're 90 years old and you're on the moon, you could avoid the coronavirus. So, maybe our first lunatics will be real old people that just want to avoid all the diseases on Earth and kept secluded and have the lower gravity. I thought that would be a good Seinfeld television program. I was thinking about that years ago, having a show called Lunatics, and just be these eccentric, super rich people that can afford to live on the moon, and they have young people that come cook for them, but it's extremely expensive, and they'll have a swim pool. Of course, the waves splash super, super high because there's less gravity. And then there'd be a prison too, and they go visit the prison. So there's a prison for these worst people on earth that are sent to the moon, and they go to see all these bad people, some, you know, like Saddam Hussein, or they go give them cookies or something like that. You know, so you have the super rich old people, and then you got the worst people on earth in a prison next door, and maybe a few other things. But it's going to be, Alcatraz never worked. It was just too expensive. So anything you try on the moon, you can just do so much easier on Earth. So I don't see large quantities of people on the moon or on Mars. Just people doing research and exploring safety, health, and wellness. That's the exploration, I believe. I've made that message clear today, right?
Yes, health, safety, and wellness.
Yes, and cost effectiveness.
Cost effectiveness. Now, cost effectiveness is another kind of interesting point. There's been a lot of discussion that cost plus contracting essentially keeps us from ever becoming cost effective, and that having kind of fixed bid contracts or milestone based contracts with teams of sort of private individuals competing against each other is the way to get to be cost effective. I was wondering what your take was on that.
Well, we are going to have two rockets now. We got the Republican rocket and the Democrat Elon Musk Obama rocket. And so they'll compete against each other. And when one blows up, the other one's going to say, look, we're the better one, or vice versa. It'll naturally kind of happen. And that'll be sad. But that competition probably has helped. I think that competition has gotten, it is good to have competition. Competition works, and capitalism works. So the United States began very capitalistic. We've had a lot of socialism. China was completely socialist. They've had a lot of capitalism. So there is some sort of balance, and they both help each other out. When one sputters, the other seems to do well, and vice versa. So you always want to try to have competition. Like I said, I'm leery about this whole commercial crew and commercial space. It just looks like soul sourcing to me to Elon Musk. But it's not the first time that's happened. Even when Dan Golden was administrator, he changed the space station program and gave it to Boeing. He just took it away from the contractor and gave it to another contractor. And some of us at NASA, we kind of scratched our heads like, how did he just pull that off? How did he just take it and give it to a different contractor? There was no competitive bidding or anything like that. But half the DoD's contracts are all just sole sourced. Half the DoD contracts are just, there's no competition. So that's a huge question. I'm not the person to answer that question. You know, there's probably economists that have a much better insight than I have to answer that question.
Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time and the discussion. I was wondering if you had any comments in closing.
I'll tell you this, I'm working on my next book. And I don't want to give the title away, but I'll just say that I think humanity right now is in transition. And this is what my next book is about. So you had A. afarensis, and then you had this transition, and then you had Homo erectus, the handy humans, tools. Their brains were bigger, but tools. They used tools for everything. They lived half a million years. Then there's another transition, and after this transition, you have Homo erectus. The brain doubles in size again, and now along with tools, they've got fire. They've got fire. And then you have another transition after Homo erectus goes a million years. Long time. Now there's a transition. And then what comes next is the next human. And in my next book, what I'm going to say is we're not quite there yet. We're just a transitionary human. We're still transitioning. And the next human's coming. And I'm going to talk about what's going to happen and when it's going to happen in my next book. And again, there will be three more renaissances before that happens. The second will be when the population stabilizes. And the third and the fourth, I don't want to give away and say when it is, or people won't buy my book someday. But we're in transition. We're not quite the next human yet. The end's nowhere in sight. People say, oh, it's the end time, da-da-da. What I say is we're not quite at the beginning yet. We're not quite there. It's coming. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Have you read those two books, Sapiens and Homo Deus?
I'm gonna write these down. What are they again?
The first one, Sapiens, it's about the history of humans past. And then there's one called Homo Deus, which is about the future history of humanity's future.
I'll look those up, but I'll tell you, to write my next book, I've been reading a lot about disease and history. And so in the Bible, talking about the future, it talks about these three horses, the famine horse, the war horse, and pestilence horse, which we kind of know now. And a lot of people predicted this was going to happen. Bill Gates, these doctors wanted to develop vaccines years ago. 1998, the Houston Chronicle had a great article about the outbreak, and everyone's warned about it coming. And I'm not going to say any expert has warned us, because if any expert had been out there, something would have been done. They say, oh, there's all these experts that are saying to have safety shields at the grocery store now, and to wear gloves. Well, why didn't they do this years ago? You know?
Mm-hmm.
But we always have a way of reacting. It seems like the stuff has to hit the fan before we react. The Titanic, you have to have the Titanic before you have lifeboats. NASA has to blow up a couple rockets before they say, you know, we should have kept those launch escape systems and had redundancy. And now with disease, we're doing things we probably should have done years ago on splash guards. And we know what's going to happen in a couple of years. You go to watch a football game or a basketball game, they're going to take your ticket. They're also going to take your temperature when you go in now. If you're sick, they're not going to let you in. So things we're going to be doing in 2 years are going to make the world safer, healthier, safety, healthy, and wellness again. You know, it's going to improve. The scary side is there's more socialism. We keep being more and more and more socialized.
Well, it's just authoritarianism. I mean, the ability to completely lock down society just because of a danger. Now all you have to do is kind of control what level of danger to be able to have that level of control. And contact tracing, on one hand, sounds really great. But on the other hand, hey, I want to know every single person you've come in contact with, they've come in contact with, they've come in contact with. You know, at what point does that become automated and gets used for other things than public health?
Yeah. So I almost lost my thought, but for Homo habilis and Homo erectus, they were the predators. They were like the 24 large predators, the giant hyena and stuff. But with tools and fire, we can applaud our ancestors, Homo erectus, for pretty much taking care of the predators to the point to where they're not even mentioned in the apocalypse. You know, we've already taken care of the predators. Famine and war, we can control those. Pestilence has always been tough. It controlled us in the dark, with the Black Death. But now, with our knowledge, nothing can seem to hold us back anymore. And I'm going to point this out in my new book. And in fact, the people that wrote the Bible, they didn't even mention the predators because it was already taken care of. And they couldn't look back and see it like we can now. They didn't understand history like we do now. But famine, disease, and war is always a problem because we control that. That's up to us. But if we stabilize if we can control all those things, then controlling population is left up to us. All those things that used to knock us down and control our numbers, nothing can do it anymore. nature has hit us with coronavirus again, and we're going to get past it. We just have so much knowledge, and it's this knowledge that is going to define the next human. That's what my book's going to be about, knowledge. And kind of really came forward in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and we're still just getting where everyone has so much knowledge now, but it's how we use that knowledge going into the future that's going to define the next human. And the next human is coming. It's not quite here yet. We're the transition. We're the in-between, like Afarensis to Homo habilis. There's that transition. Homo habilis to Homo erectus, that transition. We're not all that. We don't think we're not all that we think we are yet. We're not quite human yet. We're not the next human. It's coming. So things are going to get better. I'm not an optimist, but on the geological scale, the Earth's not going to end for another 5 billion years. And this next human, if Homo habilis lived for 500,000 years, Homo erectus for 1,000,000 years, well, the next human's going to double or triple or 10 times that. The next human's going to live for 10 million years. So humanity's going to go on for a long, long time and probably diversify into other species. That's the future.
But do you think that's going to be sorry to keep prolonging, but you're so stimulating to talk to. Let's see, do you think the next transition is actually going to be natural? I mean, our ability to actually understand genetics and to kind of manipulate that gives us kind of a tool that wasn't available to development before.
That's a dangerous question. And there's the dangerous question of artificial intelligence. And so it's there's some great dangers in the future, and we want to make sure that we're doing what's best for us. Safety, health, and wellness, you know. We need to be very careful in the future with all this technology and then applied technology. So in the 1900s, it was called modernity. Modernity was just all this new technology. People starting to go fast in a train or a car and seeing the universe and the world in a different way. And we're still doing that. And then modernism was all the philosophy coming on at that time, and postmodernism. And we know how dangerous the 1900s were with Adolf Hitler and massive killings of human beings. And you see these improvements, but you see these bad side effects too. And so I think the future, ethics and morality is going to be extremely important in the future. We need to be, ethics and morality should probably be taught in high school and theories of morality. With all that we have, we need to make sure we're being ethical and thinking about our actions in the next few hundred years, because we're going to have so much. We already have so much. If the population stabilizes, things will be somewhat better. And then a couple other things are going to happen, but I don't want to talk about those at this time. But some other things are going to happen. Global warming won't begin to go down until the population stabilizes. There's all this talk of, we've got to do this for global warming. It's not going to make an iota of difference until we stabilize the population. Politicians. So it's really the big challenge, is stabilizing the population. And then good things happen.
But in terms of morality, you see various groups and their concepts of morality and ethics and what's right and wrong vary significantly between those groups. And those thoughts about what is moral and what is right makes those groups more aggressive or less aggressive against each other, gives them greater identity or less identity, gives them the different choices on what they're going to do versus not, determines who's in the group, who's out of the group. And to a large extent, is there some type of universal morality, or is it just whichever morality is the most fittest and ultimately supplants all the other moralities? I mean, like, how does that work out?
Well, so in my book, I talk about Immanuel Kant had the categorical imperative, trying to say that people are a means, not an ends. Like like with the space shuttle program, you don't risk astronauts to just stay ahead of the Russians or something. They need to be thought of having value. Maybe if you have a war, I mean, you got to win the war. You have to do things to win the war. But if the war is over, then like if we had a Cold War and we take these risks with test pilots, maybe we take that risk to win this war, even if it's a Cold War. But once that was over, what's the rush? Or if there's no war, you don't say, well, we lost 500 soldiers today. They were just doing some testing at this army base. 500 of them died. They knew the risk they were taking. People are like, we're not at war. Why are we killing soldiers at war? So with the space shuttle program, well, the Cold War is over. We beat the Russians. Why are we pushing and building a space shuttle with that's less safe by design than Apollo, no launch escape system? And I was asking these questions, and I got reassigned. So you can have this, like you have this big program goes along, and everyone's got their jobs, and everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. So you must always you must continue to question your purpose and what you're doing and what your goals are. There's, and of course that's Immanuel Kant, and you have all these philosophers, you've got all the religions, but your philosophers in the 1900s, they pretty much shot holes in everything. And we end up being very humbled and saying, you know what, we may not always have the absolute answer. So we got to keep talking. We have to listen to everyone's perspective and second guess ourselves to have a foundation. I don't know if I really wanted to go into that. So sometimes the answer may be that we don't have all the answers and we don't know as much as we think we do. So we got to keep talking. So remember we talked earlier about how a lot of people didn't know what these government programs do. And there was a Yale experiment that was questioning all the people following Hitler. Were they just obedient to authority? So it's the obedience experiment. And I was thinking about that when I worked at NASA, when I was working on orbital spaceplane, and we weren't going to have a launch escape system. And this obedience to authority is extremely scary, that people will just do things and not really think about what they're doing on themselves. They're just told to do something, they go do it. It's the Stanley Milgram experiment. And that, I've read that and I've reread it, and it's just, that experiment scares me. And it scares me to think that people don't think about what they're doing. We just do stuff and they don't think about what we're doing. And in the future, I think we need to teach people to first and foremost to think about what we're doing. So like when this nation was founded, we have the right to bear arms, and I believe in the right to bear arms. And those arms they had then, you got the musket gun, you take it, fill it in,
Sure.
Bam, take it, clean it, pour this, bam. But by the 20th century, you got these machine guns. The technology has changed, and the right to bear arms was cannons too. If a state militia, you can have all that stuff. Well, now what do? I have the right to bear arms, so I can have nuclear weapons. It's an arm. So Thomas Jefferson said some good things, like each generation needs to think of it in context of what they're doing then and there. So we've become so powerful with our applied technology. We need to be very careful going forward. the next 10 million years, you know?
Definitely true. And I'll get your book, The Dark Side of NASA, but I'm sound even more intrigued about your next book. So I can't wait
It'll
to
be
get that
better.
one.
My
Yeah.
next better book will be even more intriguing. And I hope within a year I'll have it done. I've been writing it. Like I said, I was reading a lot of books on the history of disease, infectious disease, and how it came across the Black Death, but there's been smallpox and syphilis. Did syphilis come back? Did we give smallpox to, we gave smallpox to Central America, and in exchange, did they give us the syphilis, or did it come from Africa? The problems of developing African history, because we've tried to explore and exploit. Explore and exploit have a lot in common. Were they brave explorers, or were they just exploiting and getting stuff back and loot and making money? Is it much different than Pirates of the Caribbean, But it was really hard to go and exploit Africa because the disease is there. So the history of disease, I've read that to try and talk about the future. But I think my next book will be really good, and I hope it'll be a bestseller.
Well, I'll definitely, you definitely got one purchase here to make a step in that direction. So.
Well, listen, we can talk. I've enjoyed talking so much. This is a blast. And we can do this again, in a few months if you want to come back, and if you want to talk about the future, I'll share some more thoughts on the future, what I think is going to happen. I don't want to give away everything, but I'll give some thoughts.
If you're
the great thing
interested,
is I may be completely wrong. In fact, Kim Jong may get mad and shoot some nukes now or whatever, or we may have a totally different future overnight. But that's another scary thing. I've written letters to President Trump to tell him we need to put our nukes on the back burner. I do write letters. I write letters to these politicians, and I try to give them an approach to making the world better. So I've learned to write letters to politicians.
And
now
I'd
I need
like
to learn
to
how to podcast. I got to learn how to podcast and to get my thoughts out there, so I can have tomatoes thrown at me.
Well, I'd like to have you come be a guest speaker one of these months at our North Houston Space Society.
I'd be glad to do it.
That'd be great.
I'll do it. And
well, Paul, we probably could go on for 3 or 4 more hours. So.
Yeah. Well, we'll do it again. We'll have some specific topics about the future. Maybe I'll just talk about global warming and how that's finally going to end. It's going to take a lot longer to end than people think. But I don't want to go into that right now. In fact, I may be giving too much away for my next book, But it's going to take a lot to wean humanity off cheap coal and cheap natural gas and cheap oil. It's going to be tough.
Yeah. Well, very good. Until next time, thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it, too. This has been a great experience. I really enjoyed it, and you're very pleasant. I've enjoyed my time with you.
Same here. Thank you so much, Paul.
You bet. See you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.